Stephen Sondheim's. It's from Pacific Overture. It's the story of Commodore Perry arriving in Japan and witnesses watching treaties made in a little house and secret deals that began to sell Japan out with the help of gunpowder and secret meetings that were observed from the outside. The legend was handed down through the generations of the deals that were made in the little house. That's in honor of the Abscam arrests or future arrests, the little treaty houses all over the world that do their dirty dealing, and the scandals keep rolling on and on. Pardon my stuffy nose. I had a cold or flu this week for a couple of days and couldn't talk. It's fairly cleared, but you'll have to bear with me if I sound a little bit different. I received a letter from one of the subscribers to these tapes with a two-part question in it, and I thought I would answer it because it was more important to share this information with all of you than to just respond in the form of a letter in return. He asked me, how about a little more information on Russian military strategy? Your listeners would like to know what you feel Russia has in mind when they land grab, etc., asking me the explanation of Russia's adventure into Afghanistan. The best answer to that question that I could give is written up very concisely in an article. It's from a news magazine called World Magazine, and I'll give you the address on the printed sheet that goes with the tape, and then reprints of an article called The Threat of a New Cold War are available, and you can write the United States Peace Council, 7 East 15th Street, room 408, New York, 10003. This article is a very important one because it lists many of the points of the Soviet Union, what they were doing when they went into Afghanistan, and implying or suggesting that what they saw was the handwriting on the wall, that the United States is escalating the war against them without any intentions of backing down, and that the move into Afghanistan was defensive from their position. This article lists many of the points, 1, 2, 3, on down the line, on why the Soviet Union made that move at the time. The first point being the unprecedented seizure of the airplane at Kennedy Airport with the ballerina on it. She didn't want to defect. Her husband stayed in this country, and she was kept at the airport for 3 days and then finally was allowed to return to the Soviet Union. There was much coaxing and pleading, and she didn't want to stay here, and they should have let her leave on an airport plane if that's what she wanted to do. They also listed the creation of a crisis around the existence of 2,000 Soviet troops in Cuba. These troops have been there for 17 years, and this article claims, and I believe it, that the Caribbean situation will heat up again, that we want a U.S. military presence in the Indian Ocean. The elections were canceled in Guyana. Mr. Burnham canceled them. There have been other islands where there's turmoil about to take place, such as Puerto Rico, and many of those islands are due for revolutions, and the United States wants to secure those tightly, and they can pull their troops there. And now Ronald Reagan is campaigning against Cuba as if they're sending troops to the Middle East to assist Russia in blocking off oil supplies. So that we're putting troops in the Indian Ocean and ships without really any evidence that Russia has escalated what they were doing down in Cuba all these years. Another reason for the move was the announcement by the White House called Presidential Decision 50, saying that the arms negotiations that had been taking place to stop and nuclear testing and demilitarization in the Indian Ocean would be shelved. They said the Pentagon announced to triple the number of tactical Air Force squadrons in Europe at a time when the Soviet Union was pulling troops out of Eastern Europe. The United States was creating 5 Army divisions and is creating an 8th fleet in the Indian Ocean. Another point was a commitment to build that MX missile system. $40 billion is the cost of that, but the purpose of it was a first strike advantage against the Soviet Union. Another was the continued nuclear and economic collaboration of the United States with South Africa and that racist regime. Another reason was the announcement that Jimmy Carter had reversed his plans and did approve of construction of a $2.1 billion nuclear-powered aircraft that he had rejected a year before. Another was the allocation of funds for expeditionary forces for the invasion of the Middle East. and another was the leak of a Pentagon study which concluded that the United States would provide China with advanced technology and arms, and another was a request by the administration for a $20 billion increase in a military budget when Jimmy Carter went to the presidency and White House 4 years ago by saying he would reduce the military budget. And then the last reason they give, there's two that I can add to this, but the last one they give is the most important to me, was the forcing of NATO. Several countries didn't want atomic warheads on their soil, but NATO forced Norway and the Netherlands, and there's Germany and Italy and France and England, and they're all to have nuclear first strike weapons aimed at the Soviet Union. Now, if we're arming China and we're aiming these warheads at them, which had nothing to do with the hostages in Iran at all, or the Middle East at the time, but Mr. Brzezinski and the Trilateral Commission at NATO were gunning ready for World War III. I've mentioned many times the game that I bought preparing for World War III in 1985 and so forth. It was perfectly logical that when the Soviet Union saw that the Shah was out and Khomeini was in and the hostages had been taken, that we were unable to make a move into the Middle East, seeing how vulnerable we were there, I think they decided at that time to go into Afghanistan. There's a lot of saber rattling right now. Saudi Arabia challenging the Soviet Union if they get too close to their country. That would mean World War III. I don't know if the Soviet Union could handle all these battles at different fronts at one time, but I don't understand the sense of all the weapons and the contracts and the killing and the bullying each other, but I do understand the consequences of it, and I think all of us will be responsible for what comes down, because none of us are doing enough to try to stop it while we still have time. There was an article starting Thursday, February the 7th, that Turkey is now in the stage of collapse, that the Turkish army may have to go into martial law, and that they're sliding toward anarchy. Well, Turkey faces Russia, they border on Iraq and Syria, and the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea. It's a very important country, a NATO country, but the whole social fabric is falling apart and it needs repairing. Now, when the Soviet Union is on the border there, and if Turkey wants to become somewhat, say, a socialist like Denmark or Sweden or Norway or Canada, can they possibly solve their economic problems and the chaos there with an alternative to a military dictatorship? While we have a democracy, or still freedom of speech or mobility to travel in the United States, we have not allowed it in the very countries that we take the resources from. These people are kept subdued, their standard of living is way down, their health problems and illiteracy are terrible. We are ruining the Indian population all over the world and many native populations. And the question is, how long can we decide that the alternative to communism or socialism has to be a military dictatorship? Eventually, we can't hold the whole world, and our worst enemy is ourselves. I'm not pro-Russian, but I have to see the world from where the Russians sat when the Tsar was in power, or where the Cubans were when Batista was in power. There was child prostitution in Cuba, there was narcotics and gangland-style murders, and a bunch of hoodlums and exploitation and slave labor and torture in the prisons. And the response to all of that was to kick these people out and put in Fidel Castro. Now, I don't believe that you have to have those two extremes, but the haves will not share enough with the have-nots to make life bearable, and what comes is a revolution. It doesn't make sense to the people in the United States because we so far have been the oppressors. We haven't been oppressed. There may come a time when the American blacks and the Indians and the Mexican Americans get together and throw us off their backs and say, look, we have no housing, 66% of us fill the prisons, we have no jobs, we have no health plans, we have no security to fall back on, no employment, no education. What are you going to do with us? And if you're not going to take care of us, we're going to take care of you. So this country becomes ripe for a revolution, because as we become more greedy, like the Tsars or Batista or the ruling class in each of these countries where a revolution took place, The revolution is inevitable because survival is important and the masses eventually gang up against the few. This is all very simple. I should think it's very simple, and a lot of people believe I'm pro-Russian or that I can justify Russia going to Afghanistan. Now, the difference between their going into Afghanistan to protect their borders against enemy all around them is even different than the United States going to Chile. We don't send our tanks and airplanes. We, in quote, sell them to them at a profit. We don't like Allende. He begins to raise the standard of living of the people who brought him in. He doesn't want to give in to the American imperialists, the IT&T, the copper people, the oil people, and so forth. So when Allende is elected and he's in office, then a lawyer's firm in Massachusetts, which becomes a dummy front for the Pentagon, makes plans on how to overthrow Allende and take care of various stratas of society. We train the police that do the torturing and killing in Panama for international police, and in Washington, D.C., and in Texas. We send the equipment for torture. We give them protection. If they come to this country, they can even kill people in this country, and they're protected. Whether we physically go into those countries with tanks or whether we control them through the World Bank and credit and trade and put in the dictatorships that control the people, it's identical. I don't know if the Soviet Union is aggressive because we've never seen them operate without heads of states and government officials who want to invade them. I don't know if the Soviet Union is aggressive because ever since 1919, everybody in our government and in the Pentagon and in the military, State Department has wanted to wage a war against the Soviet Union. So maybe they're responding to the goals of first the czars that were kicked out, that incorporated and formed the Nazi groups, and then incorporated with our own intelligence and military. I don't know whether they're responding to these threats in a intelligent way, in the only way they can to survive, or whether they're paranoid. I sympathize with them and believe that they're trying to protect their homeland, and they're going to do it and do whatever is necessary as a buffer to keep us from attacking them. There are two quotations from the newspaper this week that I think are important to share with you. One was January 30th, 1980 in the New York Times. Brezhnev warns the United States about arming China. That's the title of the article, and this is the quotation. Believe me, after the destruction of Chinese nuclear sites by our missiles, there won't be much time for the Americans to choose between the defense of their Chinese allies and peaceful coexistence with us. We will not tolerate certain actions by the West. There was another New York Times article this week, the United States versus the Soviet Union, quotation from Pravda. It said, the atmosphere in the United States is reminiscent of the Cold War years. The U.S. military-industrial is now working with Dulles plans. The Dulles plans were John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. One was Secretary of State during World War II, and afterwards the other, Allen, formed the OSS and then the CIA with Nazi generals and Nazi warmongers and war criminals. It's important for each generation to study history and know those names, because when Pravda accuses us of working on the Dulles document, then you know what that means. Another listener wanted me to talk about World War III or the presidential candidates and current matters because facts about the John Kennedy assassination seem far removed from her. Well, the history of this country from 1919 up to the present involves people like John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. And when John Kennedy was assassinated and Lee Harvey Oswald was named by the official government investigators as the assassin of John Kennedy, Oswald's closest friend in the Dallas-Fort Worth area was a George de Mohrenschildt, who had been a Nazi spy during World War II. And Allen Dulles, one of the Dulles teams, the Dulles brothers, was assigned to the Warren Commission to handle all the investigations of Lee Harvey Oswald's connections as a possible conspiracy, to check out all the conspiracy rumors. And yet it was Dulles' agents that were working with Lee and Marina Oswald in setting up John Kennedy's assassination. I'm not saying Lee Harvey Oswald even fired a gun, but he had a part in the assassination, and Allen Dulles' agents were a part of that. So in Pravda it talks about the ghost of Dulles haunting us. It's the same Dulles whose name runs through the whole Cold War period and now up to the Hot War period, which is the framework that they left for us, the Dulles boys, when they both died. Charles Spears in Texas, a student of history, has compiled a list of about 200 names of some very important persons involved in the counterinsurgency game and organizations formed since 1944 that have been part of the overthrow of this country. If you send me a self-addressed stamped envelope, I'll send you a list of these names, and maybe you can check off the ones you know, and the ones that you're not familiar with, go to libraries or index of books and look up these names and let them become familiar to you. Studying history is very important, and being familiar with references, as I say, if Pravda refers to the Dulles plan, then you become familiar with what Pravda means. One of my biggest fears in 1972, at the time of the upcoming elections of Richard Nixon, was the use of the martial law plans called Garden Plot that were formulated in Atlanta, Georgia, and Ronald Reagan was a part of them in California, using the Army, the Central Intelligence Agency, the National Guard. And I was worried that Richard Nixon could possibly be killed at the time of the conventions, and martial law would be formed, and the radicals, the anti-war protesters, would be swept off the streets and taken away. That wasn't a fantasy of mine. That was a fact designed by the Criminal Conspiracy Section of the Los Angeles Police Department with the National Pentagon, and Louis Tackwood, the agent provocateur from the LAPD, had a press conference in 1971 talking about this, and later wrote it up in a book called The Glass House Tapes. And before Nixon's election, they were going to plan these violences and then make Spiro Agnew president and have total control of the government, with John Mitchell as the Attorney General and Robert Mardian, Internal Security. And, of course, later when Watergate evolved, thanks to that Scotch tape at the Watergate Hotel, it temporarily was put off for 10 years, or 8 years rather, the plans to grab the government and to silence everybody. Now, if we're going into the possibility of World War III again, and protesters or draft resistors and street organizations and people not wanting to fight, it's going to be necessary to have the same repressions to round people up again. That's why the FBI is trying to ask Congress, and the CIA are trying to allow burglaries and mail openings, which I personally know have never stopped in those last years. At least not to me, they haven't stopped in the last 10 years. But the plan to legally get it on the books that we can burglarize your home, that we can open your mail, and that we can bug and wiretap you, but you can't ask for papers about us, and if anybody tells you about us, they'll go to jail, is all getting ready, because as we get ready for the next saber rattling or possibility of war, the martial law plan stands over us. It was put off for 10 years, but now we have Jimmy Carter getting it ready for a war, and if you're ready for a war, you have to have provisions to handle the people and silence them. There was an article this last week in the Washington Post, New York Times, and also the San Francisco Chronicle, called The Hawk and Carter Cellar, and it has to do with a man named Colonel William Odom, known as the Hawk. He's Brzezinski's Brzezinski. He's going to be promoted soon to Brigadier General, and he has an office in the White House. He graduated from West Point, went to Columbia University, where he teamed up with Brzezinski, moved into the White House in 1977. Now, this article says that Odom played an important role in helping form and carry out policies dealing with terrorism, civil defense, and emergency preparedness. Perhaps typically the actual policy package on emergency preparedness was less far-reaching than the enthusiastic colonel seemed to wish. He has some pretty good ideas for what to do with us domestically. If Brzezinski has a war, Odom is the expert at home. But terrorism could be the excuse for the emergency preparedness, and this is very tricky. There's a quotation that Odom thinks the Soviet Union should be severed from the rest of the world, that we should erect an iron curtain going the other way. This is Mr. William F. Odom, now a colonel, soon to be a brigadier general. These people are some of the exact people that worked with Hitler's Reichstag, and the reason I have stressed so much the importance of American terrorism, or terrorism on the right, is that we can expect something to happen in this country which will be the excuse to take control of the country and silence those people who oppose the policies of Brzezinski and Carter, or Brzezinski, or Haig, or Kissinger. Kissinger wants to be back in office, running the country with the next president that gets in. They're advising all the time. The many hijackings, the bombings, the bank robberies, the killings of the Munich Olympic Games, the SLA, the Manson family, the mass murders in California, the Juan Corona case, are all examples of a huge pocket. There's national and international terrorism that is directed from the right, and when one event or two happens, that will be their excuse to grab. The water will be contaminated in some cities, and they'll blame terrorists. Germ or biological warfare will be released. A city will be sacrificed. Take a whole area, wipe out Ohio or particular major cities and say they have atomic bombs, and then round up all kinds of people and networks and suspects, just as all the Japanese in California were wrapped together in World War II. The excuse for silencing a protest to the next war, or to the possibility of war, will come through the guise of these experts on terrorism. And I have many, many books of the acts of terror on the right, disguised as the left. And then in comes this brigadier general from West Point, who's worked with Brzezinski, his expertise is carrying out civil defense and emergency preparedness. Remember Watergate, when E. Howard Hunt had street arteries closed off, drawings on his desk of various street arteries and their own communication network system apart from the regular channels of communication, and James McCord was on a 16-man unit of emergency preparedness. He might even have worked with Odom. I'll have to look up the back names of Watergate. But this man was at the time at Columbia and has been brought in with the Brzezinski Carter team. And if things get too thick, or if they need to consolidate to get control over our lives, they'll use the excuse of terrorism. And that's why it's so important to be educated to the manipulations now, so that if they come, we can throw them over. Just as I said before, in 1972, in the spring of 72, the Defense Department, the National Security Agency, the FBI, and CIA were getting ready to create an instant where they could create martial law. And then the Watergate exposures came, and they were so busy investigating the Attorney General, Robert Mardian, worked in the Justice Department, the Internal Division, and Maurice Stans from the Cabinet, and Richard Nixon, the President, removed, and Vice President Spiro Agnew and the top White House aides. While there was a cleansing out in Washington of some of the people behind this chicanery or involved in the covering up of the chicanery, we had a space of time in which two things were moving forward. One, the continuous plans to wage war against the Soviet Union, and the other thing was that the Watergate investigation never was closed off. Watergate 2 is just a continuation of Watergate 1. It has to do with mobsters, organized crime, Vatican scam, gun running, narcotics, stolen securities, manipulations of banks, links to the Hughes Empire, the Vegas Empire, down to Miami, to the Atlantic City mobsters, the assassination teams. All of these scandals have never yet really been cleaned out, and various people in Washington have been sitting on these so-called tips of icebergs and covering them up until they're now volcanoes and ready to explode. So just when Jimmy Carter has us on the brink of World War III, at a time where he's getting his team ready, the CIA with more muscles, the FBI with more muscles, out comes another scandal, a continuation of Watergate, that could hopefully stop some of the shenanigans going on here for the next 10 years if it's investigated properly. Abscam is an important news story. It's the most important story since Watergate, and goodness knows we've had a lot, and I hope that we continue making a wedge into what this is. I'm going to go over it slowly with you now, and then next week go into more detail about the individual persons involved. The story broke last Saturday night. Two stories broke simultaneously. Sunday morning on the newsstand, and each one is a part and related to the other, I believe. One was the breaking of the Abscam story in the East Coast, and the other was the burning down of the jail in New Mexico. I'm going to tell you what I think the relationship was between those two, but first we'll go into Abscam. This is described in the news media as, in quotes, the scandal the most serious since Watergate. For sure, it is the most serious since Watergate. It's just what Watergate festered, as I say, for the past years. It just wasn't investigated. The first story to break about Abscam was in the New York Times, an article by Leslie Maitland last Sunday. 6 lawmakers implicated in FBI sting. Of course, there were more than 6 lawmakers. There were 20 officials, public officials from New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York, and 1 member of the Senate, and then members of Congress. The part that caught my eye out of the first story from the New York Times was, in quote, Operation Abscam began with the informer's help in a successful effort to recover 2 valuable paintings that had been missing for 13 years after being taken from the United Nations platform from the loading platform of the United Nations Plaza apartment. That's separate from the UN building. That's a private apartment. As part of the negotiations that led to recovery of the paintings, law enforcement authorities said an undercover agent posed as an Arab sheik. Another article in the San Francisco Chronicle, February the 7th, 1980, the investigation came about as a relatively natural evolution of undercover operation in which undercover agents mixed in with criminal elements. They were involved stolen paintings and stolen securities, and when they started working with the criminal elements, they came into contact with federal, state, and local persons, and that stage the federal government didn't step back. They found out they were not only dealing with paintings, they were dealing with selling influence in Washington, D.C. But it started with stolen paintings and securities. Well, I read this Sunday morning, and it caught my eye because the first story said that there were 2 oil paintings, that were 2 valuable oil paintings that were missing 13 years ago, which would be 1967. And last week on the tape number 426, February the 1st, 1980, I was quoting a book of William Taub's called Forces of Power, in which I told the connections of William Taub with the White House, with President Eisenhower, with Richard Nixon, John Kennedy, his links to organized crime, to the Central Intelligence Agency, to the CIA, to Vatican banks and money, the Howard Hughes Organization, the Vegas connections, and of course that would be the Atlantic City connections, and the whole ball of wax that has been going on for a long time, the links of the mob, the Vatican, the President, the New York City, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Vegas, Miami connections. And last week on the tape, I talked about some paintings that were stolen from Mr. Taub in 1967, 13 years ago, that were given to him by the Vatican. One was a Gainsborough and the other was a Rubens oil painting. And when the Teamsters moved him, they were stolen, and then he got tangled in trying to explain the origin of the paintings because they were gifts from the Vatican to William Taub. Now, Taub works and knows the ball of wax that is involved in this kind of operation that Abscam is covering. Stolen securities, paintings, mobsters, public officials, high-up public officials. And I began to get curious if the paintings that Taub had stolen from him were going to lead later to these various payoffs and the downfall of these public officials later. Did any of the syndicate gang have any part of trying to kill him? Was this his vengeance, or did the FBI fall into these kinds of people while looking into Taub's paintings? They may not be the same paintings, but it was the same year they were missing, and he talked about his 2 oil paintings, and I spent the week trying to find out if I could trace the origin of the Abscam investigation. I'll do more about that on the other side of this tape.
Read the list from the box. Someone talks of laws. this from a box. Someone talks of laws. Then they fan a bit. Someone baked a fist. Someone knocks. Now there was a pause. Then they argue it.
This is Mae Brussell on tape 427. It's side number 2, February the 8th, 1980.
Traffic of the day. It's the pebbles on the street. It's the ripple of the sea that is happening. Not the building but beneath. Not the garden but the soul. Only cups of tea and history. And someone in a tree.
The words that I just played from Pacific Overture remind me of these meetings described in the Abscam operation. Stephen Sondheim has the intrigue of people selling out other people to their own benefit and profits. What appears as small, isolated, single events actually are shaping our lives and our history, and Abscam is that kind of event, like, as I say, the tapes at the Watergate Hotel, that is going to shape future history of this country, I believe. In the song, Stephen Sondheim says, it's the fragment, not the day. It's the pebble, not the stream. It's the ripple, not the sea, that is happening. Not the building, but the beam. Not the garden, but the stone. Only cups of tea and history, and someone in a tree. The person in the tree, translated, is watching history being made by wheeling and dealing. In this case, there were cameras and microphones and recording equipment to take down history in the early days when Japan was taken over by the American businesses. They were witnessed making treaties by a young boy in a treehouse. But the idea is the same, that little events, little meetings of people are those things that change history. Following the New York Times article 2 days after my tape with you on the William Taub links to organized crime in the Vatican and the syndicate and CIA, the whole ball of wax, I got on the telephone and I first called Leslie Maitland, the writer for the New York Times that referred to these 2 valuable paintings 13 years ago, and asked her, could she find out the name of those paintings? This is the end of the week and she hasn't called me yet. I called her on Monday. I called the Justice Department, the Information Division, asked for the gentleman who was on evening television talking about the matter on Sunday and Monday, and they told me to go to the Criminal Division. I called Criminal Division, and they turned me over to Organized Crime. I called Mr. Webster's office, the director of the FBI, and they told me to go back to the information area. I called Mr. Civiletti in the Attorney General's office to get information. I called the New York Times writers in Washington, D.C., and then I called the local FBI office, I know the agent here, and said, if you can get the names of these oil paintings, I think I have some important information on this case. Now, that is like saying after the Watergate arrests, if you tell me one fact about these people, I'll give you information of who they are. The CIA, the FBI, the Justice Department didn't want information coming in about these Watergate defendants. They wanted to block off the sources of information, and they don't want any leads filling in to break this story wide open. My local FBI agent said that he would let me know about this case. I called radio station KGO. Sunday night I talked to gentleman Ray Talafiero that Sunday night about the paintings. I talked to Bob Trebek during the week, and Jim Easton yesterday afternoon, about the getting the names of the paintings to see if we can open this ball of wax. Maybe next week I will have something to report to you. Maybe you can call the various news media and find out what paintings that were stolen several years ago started the investigation. Now that shouldn't be difficult to find out. That won't jeopardize the trials of these people. If a famous Picasso is taken, it would be reported. The men who stole it, whether they took it or didn't take it, would depend upon their lawyers and a court of law. The fact that it was stolen and recovered or stolen and not recovered, it still has a title. And yet, for some reason or other, I can't get the name of the paintings, and I'm wondering if it connects in any way to the William Taub story. He certainly would have a reason to bring down this can of worms that he was involved in. They tried to kill him, and he's still alive. Maybe what he knows keeps him alive because he could further blackmail them. But maybe there are a group of people that felt it was time for this story to break, and it's been investigated for the last couple of years and growing momentum until it spread from Brooklyn and New Jersey, Atlantic City, Pennsylvania, Las Vegas, Miami, and Washington, D.C. So far, we know that one senator has been named and 6 members of the House of Representatives, but also the arrest story said that about 20 state officials are also being investigated in terms of this scam, and it's those 20 state officials whose names I can't get. I have a few, but not all of them, so maybe the listeners in New Jersey and in Pennsylvania and New York will come forward and mail me those, because the Western papers out here don't carry them. There's several people that are named. One back east is Angelo Ericetti, Democratic mayor of Camden, New Jersey, who's also a state senator. Kenneth McDonald of Haddonfield, New Jersey, a Republican named at the New Jersey Casino Control Commission, and Senator Joseph Maressa of Blackwood, New Jersey. They also said that an undercover agent seeking land for gambling casinos was engaged with dealing with New Jersey officials, and that goes into Senator Williams and meetings in Florida and promises of a share of a mine, a titanium mine, if he would use influence to obtain government contracts. So now some of the men involved, I won't list them all because you can get them in May, the newspapers that are out, and next week maybe I'll do a diagram or chart of some of them and their relationships to New Jersey, the casinos and so forth. But some of these people are already willing to talk in exchange for security from prosecution. So you can imagine what a ball of wax this is if the gentlemen from Long Island and Brooklyn or New Jersey and Pennsylvania begin to squeal about the kind of operations that were involved. As I say, stolen art and securities and a lot of other shenanigans. There are all kinds of deals that were being made. Representative Richard Kelly was on national television on the Brinkley show, and he's the first gentleman who's come forward, and he's kind of the comic relief. He's acting like Tony Laswitz at the time of Watergate. Most important witness of all that appeared before the Watergate committee was Tony Laswitz, because a man of his description, identical height, weight, and New York accent, was seen with Arthur Bremer up in Michigan just before George Wallace was shot, and the description of Tony Laswitz fit a gentleman who was seen departing from the assassination scene in Maryland when Wallace was shot, and he was at Chappaquiddick the night that Mary Jo Kopechne died, and received large amounts of money from the White House for dirty tricks. But when he testified, he wasn't asked the right questions, and he was the comic relief. And I have a feeling that this Representative Kelly is the comic relief to make light of the investigations. As they said on the evening news this last week, if this is all that Congress has to offer, they should be fired for their incompetence, not for their crimes. But Mr. Kelly talked about meeting with a man named Gino, and they asked him why he didn't go to the FBI with his information, and he said, well, he was afraid of these thugs, and he was afraid of these people. He said they were tough, criminal kinds of people, and the doorman or the servant was like a mobster doorman and a bouncer, and he knew that he was meeting with hard criminals. Well, these were actually FBI agents that he believed were hard criminals, and he said that they offered to rough up anyone he wanted or removed anyone he wanted, which is equal to saying that these offers meant I'd murder your opponents or silence anyone who knows about you. So they're offering him the services of murder by request or damaging another person, and he went ahead and took the $25,000 anyway and was mingling with those kind of people and hadn't informed the law enforcement about it. This gentleman from Florida, who was a circuit judge down there, Representative Kelly, was removed by impeachment earlier and was voted into office again to represent his state in the House of Representatives. and is taking money in his pockets and living out of the glove compartment of the filing cabinets, but is meeting with known hoodlums who will do him service later if he needs it, and he doesn't think that's important enough to tell anybody. Some of the meeting locations were interesting. Among them, there were many, but among them was the Barclay Hotel in Philadelphia, Twin Bridges in Marriott Hotel in the Washington suburbs, the Plaza Hotel in New York, and a condominium in Ventnor, New Jersey, near Atlantic City, near the boardwalk of the Mafia headquarters for the New Jersey operations now. The Plaza Hotel is where 1960 Robert Mayhew was meeting with Sam Giancana and John Roselli and members of organized crime to perform the second marriage or the third or fourth of the Central Intelligence Agency with gangland figures to set up assassination teams. It'd be nice to know if the same room in Plaza Hotel or Suite has been kept from 1960 up through 1980, if this has been a particular safe house or haven for crime people, a particular apartment through the years. Stranger things than that have happened, and the Plaza Hotel seemed a very convenient place to meet in 1960. And again, they were meeting again to compromise congressmen and work with organized crime and figures involved in the underworld. Now, the reason I call this the Vada scam or the Carter scam is that there has not yet been a good development of the links of Jimmy Carter to organized crime. He was heavily tied up his early career with Dr. Peter Byrne, who worked with the Drug Enforcement Agency with Richard Nixon, and then went on to Jimmy Carter and was forced to leave office because of writing prescriptions for somebody in another name, and now works at the United Nations. Hamilton-Jordan connections have never been prosecuted, and they've been hushed up. The allegations of his coke connections in New York City, Club 54. The trial or investigation of Jimmy Carter's possible pressure to the Justice Department not to prosecute Vesco or extradite him, Robert Vesco, involved in $500 million swindle of the Security Exchange, his investment overseas operation, that has never been opened up. That's sitting to choke the Carters. There are links to that. The narcotic connections down with the Capricorn Records, Capricorn and Greg Allman in Atlanta, Georgia, have never been properly investigated, or the money that went into Jimmy Carter's nomination and escalation of his ascendancy to presidency. I don't think it's any coincidence that Rosalyn Carter was photographed with Jim Jones, who was into gun running and narcotics, or this Gracie, whose trial is going on right now, Gacy rather, in Chicago, the largest group of mass murders in the United States, linked to Polish organizations and the church in Illinois. And she was also photographed with several other characters. One was John Ellsworth. I did a tape on that back in December of this year, tape number 419, The Mysterious Connections of John Ellsworth, a member of organized crime and narcotics operations, photographed at the White House with the Carters. He was there socially when Begin and Sadat were signing the Middle East peace treaty, and his operation is linked to heroin markets and hashish and Mr. Arafat and Lebanon, a whole can of worms there. Also, the Carters were photographed with another character who was later killed in a very embarrassing situation, Mr. Eppolito, Eppolito. These Brooklyn mobsters were shot to death in early October of this last year, 1979, and one of them was photographed with Rosalyn Carter in the White House and used a front, his Cities in Schools project that Mr. Ellsworth got started for Eppolito, that was a front for pornography, for a possibility of killing the Shah of Iran, for arming third world countries with CIA connections and laser guns and oil in Ghana, a ball of wax that involved the Carters' organized crime, and a front used the Catholic Church fronts in Brooklyn and in New York City as a cover for pornography, and so forth. The real story of the Carter drug connections has not come out. How is it that Rosalyn Carter was with Jimmy Eppolito April 11th, 1979 at a hotel luncheon at the Hilton Hotel, and that these $50 million hash investigations that were underway linked to these people and all their trafficking and so forth can't be discovered by the Secret Service and the people around the president. Why is the president and why is his wife drawn into these things unless they're forced to appear public with these people in order to lend some credibility to them because of possible investigations in the future? Just at the time that Rosalyn Carter went to Rome, to Vatican, to see the Pope, and the Pope came to the United States, was the time when the stories of the organized crime links of Michelle Sindona in New York City and the Vatican Bank were breaking, and the connections of Vatican money that was invested with mobsters, again, in narcotics, organized crime. And these stories of the Gambino family links to the Vatican that I've been putting on the tapes recently indicate that this arrest that has been taking place, or the investigation that's been taking place, could lead into all those areas that I've been talking about of the criminal element in the same cities we've been referring to in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Long Island, Florida, and Washington. On tape 414, November the 9th, I talked about the Vatican finances and recently particular witnesses that had been gunned down by the mafia that had information of the Vatican links to the Gambino family. That goes back to tape 414. I have many tapes on the Vatican, and recently I've been talking about their transferring of oil paintings and holding money of the Nazis and works of art of the Nazis, and questioning whether William Taub got his gift from the Vatican by way of Nazi confiscation from World War II. The question that remains is, what was stolen from William Taub in New York City 13 years ago, and what was stolen in New York City in the way of oil paintings that set off Abscam 13 years later, that this entire connection of organized crime, stolen security, stolen art, goes right to members of Congress and the House of Representatives. Oh, I was asked by one of the subscribers of the sources of information that the Shah of Iran or his sister were interested in organized crime or in drug traffic. There are books, and I'm trying to get the many sources I can to answer that question. One book, The Crown Cannibals, that I referred to a few weeks ago, by Rezi Bahrani, has a quotation that I'll share with you about the Pahlavi Foundation, and also a report by an organization, MERIP. This was written up also in Time magazine, June 23, 1975, and there are several dates for sources of this information. It talks about November 17, 1960, Geneva police arrested Princess Ashraf, that's the twin sister of the Shah of Iran, for being in possession of 2 suitcases containing $2 million worth of heroin. Time gave the story highly critical coverage, which evidently must have upset the Shah. Mike Wallace, quoting to the Shah from a piece in the Washington Post, read, "A wealthy Iranian businessman says not a truck can move anywhere in this country without a payoff going to Princess Ashraf." That's from Time, October 22nd, 1976. It also reported bribes paid to Prince Shahram. Time magazine, June 23, 1975. Northrop paid $705,000 to the Iranian Prince Shahram, that's the nephew of the Shah of Iran, a member of the imperial family, for services such as helping the company find a good Iranian architect. Northrop was part of a consortium that received a $200 million contract to build a telecommunication system in Iran. And as I say, Hart Morgan, representing ABC News and Radio and TV, was on telephone from Iran to San Francisco radio and was talking about the narcotics traffic and the other business traffic, and that everything went through the hands of the twin sister of the Shah of Iran, and acknowledged on conversation on the air about the narcotics traffic. A very terrible thing happened this weekend, simultaneously with the breaking of the Abscam story on the East Coast, and I believe they are directly related to each other, and that was the seizing of the state penitentiary in New Mexico by the inmates. This is an example of the barbarian way that people had the potential they have to become, and what is coming in this country and how it's coming down. And if you think it's isolated to that state penitentiary, then ask yourself where the 100 or 200 missing people are that did the murders in Jonestown that are out as programmed assassins to kill again, and where are the 50 missing people from the New Mexico penitentiary? Are they out to kill again? Now, the thing that's so frightening about this is that there's certain people that I've watched move up into positions of power, and I keep using their names. There's in Germany when you had Goering and Goebbels and Himmler and Heydrich and these various Nazis working their way up, Canaris and so forth, into the system of the Nazi organization until they took power in the government. And I warned last November, tape 414, November the 9th, 1979, watch out for California violence and politics. Now, I didn't anticipate this would spread to New Mexico, but I anticipated these figures would become national someday. And I referred to the movement and appointment in San Francisco of Raymond Procunier as undersheriff, because Procunier, as I described on that tape and on the printed sheet, worked with the CIA, the FBI. He set up race violences. He set up prison riots in California. He was the daddy of the San Quentin Six shootout, and George Jackson was killed with a gun brought in from the Los Angeles Police Department. He was head of the prison system, setting up the murder and later the trial of the Soledad brothers, the Marin shootout when Judge Haley was killed, and that's where Angela Davis was arrested. I wrote, "Look out for violence in San Francisco, the future center of the martial law plan." These men I felt would be teams of the future terrorist organizations. There's names that you must never forget in the East or West or Midwest or North. One is Evel Younger. The other is Ed Davis. Evel Younger used to be the district attorney in Los Angeles when Robert Kennedy was killed and went on to be the attorney general of the state of California. Ed Davis was chief of police in Los Angeles when Robert Kennedy was killed and set up the criminal conspiracy section of Los Angeles Police Department that was linked directly to the White House and the Pentagon and the CIA and the National Security Agency, and had organization that had the plans to kill Richard Nixon in '72. Charles Bates was head of the FBI, trained in London and Chicago when Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were killed, was in Washington covering up the Watergate for the FBI, and then was in California responsible for the SLA escapade counterintelligence operation of the Pentagon. Mike Kerb is now the assistant governor, acting under Jerry Brown, who's away all the time, and Kerb brags, it's in the media, that I run the state. And Charles Gaines, who was chief of police in Oakland when the violence was coming down with the Black Panthers and the counterintelligence operations, then went to San Francisco, where there was so much violence and killings in Jonestown that involved the San Francisco police and the killing of the supervisor and the mayor of that city, that Gaines finally was removed. But we have a team here that will be national someday: Younger, Davis, Bates, Kerb, Procunier, and Gaines. Well, when the riots came down in New Mexico, in the prison, the first thing I saw in the newspaper was that January the 14th, less than 3 weeks before the rioting and violence came, there was an investigative report issued, and they had called in Ray Procunier from California. Procunier's report for New Mexico said that the first priority should make a prison, in quotes, safe from escape, stabbings, and riots. Yet it was Louis Tackwood, who wrote the Glass House tapes, who worked for the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department, that said he was brought into the Department of Corrections in California to set up prison riots. He would come into prison, be in a cell with somebody, and they'd say, "What's your rap?" And he'd say, "I stole a car, I stole something." "How long you're serving?" 5 years. Then Tackwood would set up operations where the scapegoats, or the people that the California authorities didn't like, could be killed or kept in prison for life. Then, because of the violence, the prison was broken up, and someone would be sent to Folsom or Chino and dispersed, among them Tackwood, who then, when he got out, would get in a civilian suit and go back and work again for Squad 19 of the Los Angeles Police Department, or the criminal conspiracy section of the Los Angeles Police Department. So 3 weeks after Ray Procunier visited this prison, which I title him one of the most dangerous members of our society, of our so-called law enforcement society, the prison, had these riots. Now, what happened in that prison? It wasn't just food and general conditions. There was one goal in that prison. They were after the informers. The informers were in a special wing. And before this riot came, there had been bars in that prison to separate the main office or the control center. But the bars were removed and glass was put in, and they were told it was glass that wouldn't break, and of course it broke. And these very sophisticated certain prisoners went directly to filing drawers, and that's important, to get the names of informers. Now, when you're trying to get drug links that possibly link to Robert Vesco or to Jimmy Carter, Atlanta, Georgia, or the Shah of Iran, or Barry Goldwater in Arizona, or the Vegas connections of organized crime and people that have done murders or squealed or witnesses to trials, these witnesses were in a protective custody. They were called like the snitches. The important people that make prosecutions possible were in what you call a protective section. So these men knew to go to the filing cabinets and look for the names, and they broke down the protective section and they decapitated them. They put rods through their heads. They cut off the arms and legs or limbs. There was torture. There was gouging of eyeballs with electric soldering things. They said there were shootings. There were guns. There were iron rods. You name it. Mutilation of every person. This total affair, this riot there, was to clean out the informers' wing. Whether there were 30 important informers or whether there were 5 and they had to kill 30 to do it, they did it. Now you may say, is it worth the establishment problem to build a $50 million prison again? Are these people worth that? Well, evidently there is much more to this story than has come out yet. And I would say that buildings are very cheap, whether through bonds or tax money in New Mexico, they'll get it. But New Mexico is a state riddled with organized crime and murders and informers. And the true story of the Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico crime, drug connections is not out. And I'll venture to say that some very important witnesses that were in those protective cells were wiped out. And the sole purpose, in fact, one newspaper article said the purpose of these riots was to get these informers, and they were not doing it just out of frenzy. They went specifically to filing cabinets to get the names and know which cells to go to get the guys. The facts are that 3 weeks after Pecunier was there were over 1,200 men in the prison, something like 1,238, and there were only 15 men on the staff at the time of the riot. When the tortures began at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday, people with binoculars were watching outside and knew that people had been decapitated and tortured, and yet nothing was done for 24 hours. They could have used a gas or chemical or spray to subdue everybody and come in, but they allowed these particular informers to be killed and tortured before they ventured to come in. Not a single guard was slain. All of them got out. So evidently they knew that something was going to come down, because it would be impossible that a guard wasn't hurt. The men went to the files, as I said before, to get the list of the informers. The informers were all tucked into one place, identifiable, and every single one of them in that section was murdered. Like Jonestown, when 125 or more killers, assassins, departed, there were at least 50 that departed from New Mexico and are unaccountable. And the question is, were they dressed up provocateurs? Were they brought in and set up the violence and then left? Did they know which files to go to? Were they put in the cells to know which names to look for? And then they were able to sneak out, because some did get out there. And the point is that Louis Tackwood said that the LAPD, the Criminal Conspiracies Section, that Ed Davis and Younger and Pecunier and these people were setting up a Gestapo. And this certainly is Gestapo activity, this kind of brutality. And then to disperse these people in other places, they have promised strong prosecution for the people responsible, but yet some people are missing, and I'm sure they'll never show up to be prosecuted. Wednesday's newspaper, February the 6th, from Santa Fe, New Mexico, said authorities said 50 inmates were unaccounted for. They did not mean they should be presumed to be dead or missing, but they refused to identify them and tell you what they were doing there. I wonder how many of those future people will turn up later as informers such as Tackwood, writing books or telling us about it. Because of so many stories breaking of drug connections from the White House, the Vatican, and all over the world, and because special informers are set in a protective cell, I fear that we will never be able to get the information that was in the heads of these people, and that there had to be some kind of a link, considering the people involved here that have other links in common. These events taking place this last Saturday, I believe, have some connection to each other. One of the values of taking these tapes is, when these events take place, to go back to the past sheets that I've given you and the past tapes and look it up and remember what I said about these people, because they will appear and reappear until we make them account for their actions, for what they're doing at the time that they're visible on the scene. Our time is up. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. You take care. There's plenty of news. I could film the next tape for next week right now, but we'll take it as it comes and do the best we can, and I'll be with you next week, hopefully.